Bwana Isaendi sunga wangu, shetani akiniona iye atetema.
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 Iye atetema, iye atetema, shetani akiniona iye atetema.
Yeah, just after we were saved, I got this hunger to reach people. I'd been an agnostic, and after I got saved, I knew there must be lots of people around that are just like I used to be, and I had this hunger to reach out to them. And I wanted to get involved in evangelism. I had no idea how to do it. And then our church got involved with a door-to-door evangelism program they were running. And I said, I'm going on this. And I said to her, it will be ideal if the two of us go together. And but she wasn't interested.
Yeah, you know, I just found my place in the worship team. I really loved it. And I said, no, I don't want to do this. I'm not so good at speaking to strange people, but you can go, you know. You have my blessing, go, but I'm not going. And then one night during this time I had a dream. And I saw two streams of people, one stream going to heaven and one stream in the opposite direction going to hell. And I was in the stream going to heaven, and it was like we didn't have gravity, or it was a very exhilarated feeling, very joyful, like almost like floating, very exciting. But then in the opposite direction, these people were on their way to hell, and it was like a nightmare. It was really bad. They all had black clothes on. Some of them were so scared they couldn't walk. You could see the fear on their faces. Some had to carry others, and they were just walking very slowly, almost not wanting to go, you know. And I woke up and I said to him, I'm with you, because I can't walk past people and know they're on their way to hell and not doing something about it. And so from there on we did everything together.
Our initial evangelism efforts didn't bear much fruit, and we just found that a lot of people have already been saved in our area, so we sort of were a bit discouraged. But then we heard about Campus Crusade, that they were doing training to use the Jesus film as an outreach tool. And we thought, well, our friends were going and they invited us along, so we said, well, you know, we wanted to do anything for the Lord at that stage, what we could. We used very enthusiastic young believers, you know. And so we went on this training. It was over a weekend in South Africa. And we went to this squatter camp, and because we were going into these places where there was no electricity, we used to take a generator along. And as we did this training, I thought, wow, this is amazing. I can see this reaching people, showing the Jesus film, and then doing skits in between, and evangelistic talks, and then afterwards inviting people to accept Christ as their Savior. And as we were training, because we were so many on the course, when he was training the people how to use the projector, because I'm short, I couldn't see over their shoulders, and I thought, oh, I don't know, I'm ever going to operate this complicated projector. And but then at a point, the guy said, look, when we go tonight for the first time, I need someone to guard the generator, because it's high crime rate areas that we go into. And somebody needs to sit on the generator to make sure it's not stolen while the show is going on. And I said, that's it. I can do that, you know. I can sit on it and I will not budge there. And I actually found my vision for missions is generator guarding. And so we went that evening and I sat on that generator, and it was just awesome to see the reaction of the people, many of whom had never seen a movie before. And then seeing the story of Jesus and how many of them came forward. It was a cold night. The kids were sitting there shivering, and Bets actually gave one of the little boys her jersey. And he sat the whole night, and she sort of wrote it off, you know, that the jersey's now gone. in this poor community, it'll definitely be stolen, you know. And then, but after the movie, after the people had come forward to accept Christ, this little boy came back to her with a jersey neatly folded up, and she was just totally in tears. And we were just blown away, and we knew we'd found our vision for missions. We were going to find a team, which we did afterwards, and I was going to guard the generator. And so this we did. We found a team of people, and they said they were going to go on this outreach, and we said, we're going along with you. We're finished with the training now. We want to go and use my generator guarding abilities. And so off we went, and when we got to their house, we were said, like, when are the rest of the team going? Because it was just the two of them, old people in their 60s, and us, you know. And they said, oh no, this is us, this is it. And I'm like, oh my goodness, you know, so few people going into relatively dangerous areas. But then we heard they'd gone alone, just the two of them, and I thought, how do they do this? So we went along, and when we got there, we helped them unpack and set up the screen, and out came the generator, and, you know, here's my vision, you know. And as I was carrying it, I said to him, where do you want it? And he said, right here in front of the car. And he had this big bull bar on the front of the car, and I thought, okay, well, at least I can lean with my back against the car. But then suddenly he pulled out this thick chain and put it through the bull bar and through the handle of the generator and locked it with this big lock. And I'm like, there goes my mission vision. I've been replaced by a chain. And I was like, oh my goodness. And we said to him, well, what do you want us to do now? Because now suddenly I had no job anymore. And he said, well, just do a prayer walk around the whole area where the people are going to be sitting on the soccer field. And so that we did. We walked around and we prayed that the Lord would protect us and protect the people, and that, you know, all these kinds of things. And as darkness came, we started showing the movie, and many people pitched up and sat there. But there was quite a bit of resistance from nearby witch doctors. Just across around us was a grass field, and the houses were there, and they were playing drums and doing all kinds of witchcraft and sorcery to try to block this whole Jesus film showing. And of course, this friend of ours, who became our good friend later on, he rushed off to that house and stood right outside the house and prayed against it and rebuked Satan and all these kinds of things fearlessly, you know. But then the witch doctor set that field on fire, and the fire came towards us where we were watching the movie, and you could see the people looking at the field and seeing the fire approaching. But the amazing thing, that was the first miracle we saw, is when the fire reached the place where she and I had walked praying around, not really knowing what to pray even, the fire stopped right there. And we were in the middle of this place, and the people could see the movie, and a lot of them came to the Lord that night. But the best part for me was when that actual same witch doctor came, and he gave his life to the Lord. Mm-hmm. And all these amulets and fetishes, they actually took, and we threw it into the fire that he had started, and it burned it. And that was so awesome, and we were hooked after that. And we asked the people, you know, our friends, what do we do now after the movie, people coming forward? He said, pray for the people. My goodness, we never really prayed for somebody, especially strange people. But we did, you know, we just laid hands on them and asked them, what can we pray for you? And we did, and the Lord did miracles. And it was just like we were totally hooked after that, because we knew, you know, God wants us to do this, and we were able to bring the gospel to people who hadn't heard before.
Okay, so we started going on more and more outreaches with this older couple, and eventually we got our own equipment, and sometimes we went out alone. And then we started to feel more and more serious about missions and doing outreaches. So we went to our missions pastor at church and asked him, what should we do next? What's the next step? And he said, go and do a world perspectives course. So we found out about one, and we went on it. It's a 15-week course over a period of time, once a week. In the meantime, we were doing outreaches and things, and on this course we just sometimes wanted to just head away, because we realized how many mistakes we were making. Some good stuff we did as well, but we realized we need a lot of training still, and some of the things that we did wasn't that strategic actually. And but we were getting more and more serious about missions. And towards the end of the course, Hendrik went to the course presenter, and he started talking to him about the next step and our plans.
Yeah, we went to see him at his house, and we were at the end of this World Perspectives course, which is now the Kairos course. And we went to see him, and we had this master plan worked out in our heads that we were going to go 6 months full-time in the mission field. And I was doing computer software development and also consulting in computers. And I decided I'll do consulting for 6 months of the year, and then 6 months do missions, and then finance it in that way. So we went to see this guy, and as we explained all this to him, he just looked at me and said, "That's not what the Lord wants. He wants you either in fully or not at all." And the moment he said it, I realized he's exactly right. He's exactly right. But I could just feel the blood draining from my face as the shock of this realization came over me that my life is going to change totally. From being a computer geek to being a missionary. And it was on a Friday that we went to see him, and that whole weekend I was just in a state of shock. I just remember sitting there on the couch and not being able to move almost. But I realized afterwards what I was actually doing, what I'd been doing was counting the cost and realizing what it's going to cost us to do this in all seriousness. And after 2 days I was fine. And then we could go ahead with our calling that God was calling us into. Doing this Jesus Film ministry for some time. And one day suddenly our friends who were going to go to Mozambique on an outreach with another group, they couldn't make it, they couldn't go. So they asked us to go.
Well, I wasn't happy about that because a while ago, before that, we went to Mozambique on an holiday. And we didn't have a nice experience because the country just came out of a war, so they were very security conscious, and we were stopped next to the road and searched, and guns were on us. And when we came back from that holiday, I said never again. So I put my foot in Mozambique. I will not go there ever again. So when our friends asked us to go in their place, I was very reluctant. I didn't want to go.
Yeah, but in the end, we figured out we could go through another route through a neighboring country called Zimbabwe and then go into the central Mozambique that way, so we wouldn't have to drive too far in Mozambique. So she sort of relented and said, well, okay, you know.
And we were the group.
Yeah, we were with the group and so on. And she'd actually said to the Lord that, you know, she'll go into missions anywhere except Mozambique. And coincidentally, I said to the Lord, I will go anywhere except to Muslims. And at this stage, there were no Muslims in that area, but it was Mozambique. But there we actually saw the great need of people who had never heard the gospel. This country had just come out of this terrible civil war, and the gospel had just been wrecked. And before that, it had been a Marxist country, so the gospel just wasn't there anyway to speak of. And we just saw the hunger of the people actually wanting the gospel. And we thought, we've got to go to people who've never heard. So on the way back, we were talking all the way. And what are we going to do and how are we going to do this? So we decided to look, having learned about least reach people groups, we went to look what least reach people groups are there in Mozambique. And we saw up to the area where we had been, most of them were reasonably, there was gospel witness and so on, even though not enough. And we decided further north in Mozambique. Now Mozambique is this long country on the east coast of Africa, and it's about 2,500 kilometers of coastline. And we were looking like at the Joshua Project. We had a book, but nowadays you get the website joshuaproject.net. And we were looking at that information about Mozambique. And we came across a number of unreached people groups in the north there, and we saw, oh, okay, this is quite far away from where we were. But you know, that was fine, but we saw almost all of those groups, I think all of them except one were Muslims. And so this now challenged my view of, you know, she was now prepared to go to Mozambique, and what about me not wanting to go to Muslims? Well, in the end, the Lord spoke to me, and we felt, okay, we must go to a Muslim group in Mozambique. And we started praying about those different groups, and that's how we came upon the Mwani there, a coastal Muslim group in the north of Mozambique, and in the end that's where we went. Well, by this time we knew we were going to a Muslim group in the northern part of Mozambique, and we were sort of committed to that. And but I was still working, and we'd been raising up partners to support us and to pray for us and so forth as we went. our kids were small, and she was learning homeschooling, so she could homeschool them because there were no schools where we were going. And it was quite rough because there were no real roads to speak of. In the northern provinces where we were going, there were still 2 million landmines planted, and everywhere you went, there were just landmines next to the road and markings. And it was only a place where the real outdoor type of people went. And just to tell you, I was a computer geek, and my slogan had always been, my idea of roughing it is slow room service. And so I said to the Lord, I remember one day coming home from one of the customers where I was consulting, and I stopped at home, and I sat in the car, and I said to the Lord, I'm not the right person. Really, you should rethink this, I'm prepared to go in all these things, but I'm not really, you should get one of these guys that knows all about four-wheel drives and likes the outdoor life, because we were going to have to stay in tents for the first few months, and this was just not me, and I was going along like this to the Lord, telling him, explaining to him, that he's actually chosen the right person. And I didn't hear the audible voice of God, but just suddenly, clearly into my head dropped this thought of, you weren't my first choice. And the others all said no. And it was just struck me so hard, and I thought, oh my goodness, if I look like this, what's the next guy going to look like? And then I also realized, I don't know quite how, I just knew that I was more or less the 8th person. And the first 7 had said no. And I just knew, at that moment, God just convinced me just by dropping that thought into my head, that this is where we've got to go and what we've got to do.
So we had training with the World Perspectives course, and we started to read up a lot on strategies and Muslims and things, but we were a bit overwhelmed by what we were getting into, and how do you do it? This is an unreached people group. They speak another language. It's far away from everything, and we were just really praying a lot more and more, and just thinking about how are we going to do this. And I was praying one day, and I said, Lord, this is too big. We can't do it. It's just the two of us. And these people, there's 100,000 of them. What are we going to do? And God gave me a vision, and I saw a big desert, nothing, it's just the barren, arid area. And as I looked at this area, I saw a flower popped up, a colorful flower, and then I looked over there and another flower popped up, and I looked over there and 2 popped, and then 5. And as I looked, this whole place just became like a carpet of color, and it's all flowers. And I felt God said, this is how I'm going to do it. And it was just years later that when we learned more about strategies and things that were happening, and when we learned about church planting movements and exponential growth, and that's what I saw in the vision actually, and we didn't know about this. So God prepared us for what He was going to do long before we didn't even knew about all the things.
And the best part is that the first female Mwani, the first woman who ever became a Christian, her name was Rosa, which means rose, which is a flower. And that was so awesome, just the way that God had prepared us for this whole thing. And she quickly led some others to the Lord. The first man that came to the Lord didn't, but it was this cluster that started happening. And so that's how we started to see the revelation of this vision that God had given to her. And it really encouraged us through our time there.
And even some other missionaries who also came and worked with the Mwanis, we shared this vision with them. And it almost became the collective vision of everybody working with the Mwanis. Whenever they would have a breakthrough or somebody came to the Lord, they would write to others, hey, another flower popped up. And it sort of, it bonded us all together, looking for the flowers, in the desert.
Well, so we got to this least reached people group, and the village that we were going to work in was about 10,000 people staying there, and it was at the bottom of the sea, because on the coast, right on the sea, because Mwani, which is the people group name, actually means beach in their language, and they lived along the beaches, so they're known as the beach people. And there was a little hill, And people had warned us, don't go into that village, they'll slit your throat, you know. And we were like, surely they won't do that, you know. But we went up onto this hill and looked down and prayed and asked the Lord, where do we go? It's this big village, where do we go walking? And, you know, to sort of make our first contacts, where do you start? Because we couldn't speak the language at that stage. At that stage, we'd spent some time learning Portuguese. It took us about a year, which is the national language of Mozambique. But the Moani people have their own language called Kimwani, and many of them couldn't even speak Portuguese. And so we decided, okay, we're going to pray and ask the Lord to show us where to start. So we did. And after we prayed, both of us felt the Lord attracting our attention to a specific part of the village. So we immediately obeyed and went down and started walking there. And it was quite surreal in many ways, because no white people ever went there in those days. And as we were walking there, the people looked at us strangely, and little kids were running away. I remember one day, a later day, there was a little boy that ran away from us so powerfully that he ran out of his pants. And so some of the people were really scared of us, and others looked a bit hostile, and others sort of looked at us strangely. And so we sort of gingerly walked there, and it's all these sea sand little roads and paths, and between these mud huts. And we walked around, and suddenly there was this mud hut, and there was a woman sitting on the veranda in the front, on the low veranda, very, very humble little huts. And then Bets just started talking to her.
At that stage, as he said, we learned Portuguese, and we just started to get some words in Kimwani, so we could greet and say, I can't say much in Kimwani, whatever, you know, just survival phrases. And as we walked up to this woman, she was just so friendly and interested, you know, and with this, and Portuguese is not good, and so with this little bit of Kimwani, I actually don't know how we did it. We communicated with one another, and I got it over to her that I wanted her to teach me Kimwani, if she would teach me Kimwani. And she was just like a person of peace. She was so friendly, and I think her sister came along afterwards there, and they just invited us back. And I did that. I started going to her house regularly. Hendrik sometimes went with me. And after a long time, like 6 months or something, we met her husband. He was never there when we were there. But that one day he was there, and he was such a nice man. And then it came out that he was the sheikh of this village, and he had this mosque that he was, it was his responsibility. And he always said if he knew the man was the sheikh of the village, maybe we would felt a bit intimidated, but we didn't. And by the time we got to know this, we were friends with him. And they stayed our friends, and they were actually, like as I said, the persons of peace in that village. God really led us supernaturally to that woman sitting on the veranda that day. And she became my very, very good friend.
And it was difficult getting a house to stay in that village. And at this stage, after we'd met this man and found out who he was, we managed to get a house there. And the house happened to be 3 doors away from the mosque that he ran. And he turned out to be this person of peace that Jesus speaks about, that if you go into a place, you must find a person of peace. And he was our person of peace. And a few times in sticky situations, he came through for us and really, I think, saved our bacon in a certain way. And because he was our good friend all the time that we were there.
So we moved into the village, and I did homeschooling with the kids in the morning. Hendrik had a language helper, more formally, that he would go to every day. I would just go as I could, you know, I had other things to do at the house. But I would try and go in the afternoons, go out and make friends and see people. Our Kimwani was really on at the survival stage still. And so I would go out, and I wore these funny clothes, and I had a headscarf on, and it was so hot. And I could remember walking and sitting there, feeling the sweat tickling down my body, and there were flies, and the smell was not nice. And people was, you know, they looked at me strangely. When I tried to speak Kimwani, many times they would just laugh at me, ridiculing me. The kids were touching me all the time. So actually, if you look at all of these things, I was totally out of my comfort zone. It was actually very stressful, and because I didn't want to make mistakes, I wanted them to like me. I wanted to give a good impression and whatever. But every time when I would call it my walkies, I would go on a walkie, and when I came back, felt so exhilarated and content and joyful. And I would just thank God. Thank you, God, you're making it easy for me, because it's such a difficult thing that I'm doing actually. And then the next time again it would happen, I would come back feeling so content. And one I was really talking to God and saying, God, I don't understand this, because this is difficult, but you make it easy for me, but I'm just thanking you, I don't know why. And I felt God sort of in a surprised response saying, but don't you know that your act of worship, you're worshipping me? And it was a total shock to me, because worship, I always thought that was music and singing and praying and things. But this was stuff like just being nice to people, talking to them, giving them a headache pill or whatever, trying to understand what they're thinking, getting to know their family. And God saw that as act of worship, because I was loving them. And that changed my attitude totally from then on. When I went out, I knew whatever I did, even if it was just going sit with an old lady and just asking how she was, God saw that as an act of worship. Yeah, that was a big insight for me.
We soon realized that just doing evangelism like with the Jesus film, and then doing missions to a least reached people group, what they call frontier missions, is a very different situation. We had to go through this whole time of preparing to be able to reach out to the people. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the language of Mozambique is Portuguese, and we couldn't find anybody there who could speak English in that area. So we had to learn Portuguese to quite a fluent level first, which took us about a year, because we had tapes and we had books and everything. But then we had to learn Kimwani to be able to speak to the hearts of the people, because if you don't speak to the heart of someone, you can only do that in their own language. And most of those people didn't have the level of Portuguese to be able to understand the gospel, so we had to learn their language. The only challenge, of course, was that Kimwani was an undocumented language. Bible translators had been working on the Bible there, and there was a few words written down, but we actually had to develop our own dictionary, and we had to go through this whole process of learning the language. And what we did is, in the mornings, she would be homeschooling the kids, and I would go out to a Mwani friend who was my language helper. And I would go with a little tape recorder, and then I would record some phrases that he was saying, and I'd put it on the computer, and then listen back to them over and over to start understanding the language. And in the afternoon, she would then also listen to the recordings, and then together we would go out to friends while the kids were having their off time or doing homework and this kind of thing. And in that way we learned the language gradually, but it was quite a challenge, starting from nothing, no dictionaries, no tapes, no educated people that can help you to learn the language. And but of course then the next challenge we faced was, what do you teach them if you don't have the Bible? You don't have any songs in their language, you don't have any lessons or anything you can teach them.
And they're illiterate.
And they're illiterate, that's the other thing, you can't even just give them tracts or anything like that, and they couldn't understand any other language. So basically we were left over to having to translate all of that stuff. And once my Kimwani was up to a certain level, and we were still at the same time befriending people and so forth, I started going and translating chronological Bible stories into their language, starting from Genesis, because Muslims don't find the Old Testament offensive in any way. And the whole idea was that we would then start with lessons from starting at the Old Testament, but we had to translate all of them. And I sat with this language helper of mine, and he helped me to translate all these things, and also to give cultural examples in those lessons. And if you look at the whole process, it took us about a year to learn Portuguese, which is a reasonable time for adults to learn a language to a level of fluency where you can actually speak to people, not just read a bit or whatever, or just greet, but be able to speak to them. And then it took us another year and a half to learn Kimwani, and it took us about a year and a half to translate all these materials. So if you add that up, that's already 4 years, that we had to take just to do the groundwork to be able to reach out to the people. So that's the challenge we faced. But the Lord gave us grace and favor among the people during that time. And we became part of the community. So it was a time of getting to know the people and them getting to know and trust us. So it was really good. Then one day we were still learning the language, and we were walking along the street, and there was a man with a little stall selling some books, I think it was. And she said to him, "Have you ever heard about the Lord Jesus?" And in Portuguese, we were learning Portuguese at that point. The word Senor means Lord, but it also means Mr. or Sir, that kind of meaning. And so she said to him, "Have you ever heard of the Lord Jesus?" And this guy sort of looked into the distance and thought deeply, and he said, "Does he live near here?" And that's when we actually realized what a least rich people group is people who actually have never heard anything about the gospel message, nothing. And if they left alone to themselves, they would never hear the message of salvation at all, because nobody around them has heard it themselves. Well, we also did something that we realized afterwards. We jokingly call it curiosity evangelism. As I was going back and forth to my language helper, walking there every day, there were people along the road, and I used to greet them, and then they would say, "Why are you going there?" And I would say, "I'm learning your language," and so forth. And after a while they said to me, "But you speak the language quite well now, why are you still going to that guy?" And at this stage we had started translating the Old Testament stories, my language helper and I. And so I said to them, "Well, I'm busy. Have you heard that you should be reading, you as a Muslim should be reading the Torah as well, the Old Testament?" And I said, "Yes, we know that, but where can we get an Old Testament to read it? Because the Quran actually says they should." And I said, "Well, that's what I'm doing. I'm busy translating stories from the Old Testament into your language." And every day they would ask me, "So how far have you gotten? How far have you gotten?" Because we actually did 66 stories in total, Old and New Testament. And so it took quite a while. And every day they said, "But what are you doing? What are you doing? You know, how far are you?" And they got so curious that by the time we'd finished the translations, they just like, "When are we starting? You must tell us these stories. We really want to hear them."
So while Hendrik had this, his storytelling with Ipopu going on, that's the man's name, I was sitting with Rosa. She actually came to me and she said she heard that we were telling stories to people, and she also wanted to hear it. So I didn't even pick her out as a potential person to tell stories to. She came to me. So I started telling stories to her, and she became a Christian. And then we had to go on holiday, and left her there in the middle of everything. And when we came back, she led 7 of her family to the Lord. So I instantly had this little group going with these young believers, all women. And I just loved telling stories to them, and they really responded well to the stories. One day we were sitting there, I was telling them the story about Jesus and how the people brought the adulterous woman to him, and he just went down in the sand and right with his finger in the sand. I was doing that story to them. They just loved it. I had to tell it over and over again. And whenever I would tell the story, I would go down and write with my finger in the sand, and then the kids would go, and it was just chaos. But we were sitting outside the house on a veranda, and in front of the house was a big open piece of ground, and cars went there and people walked there. And so as I was going through the story again, a lady walked there in the road, and Rosa, she saw it was a friend, and she started yelling at her. Her name was Eva, which is Eve. And she said, Eva, come, you must come here, come listen to this story. You're an adulteress, this story is for you. And I was just so embarrassed. This woman, she wasn't bothered by it at all. She just came over and sat down, and they said, tell her the story. But now everybody was excited. It was the 4th time they heard it, so everybody pitched in, and they all told the story. The kids were writing in the sand. It was just chaos. And that was it. It was just another day in the story. And a few weeks later, Rosa came to me and said, listen, I'm going to Eva's wedding, and I was like, what? And what happened was that Eva became so convicted of this story, during the story, that she went to the man that she was staying with, the Armenian one, And she convinced him that they should make a commitment to one another and get married. She was still a Muslim, he was a Muslim, so they got married in a Muslim ceremony. But it was just the power of this story and the conviction it brought to her. And she was so open to hear more about Jesus. She thought he was fantastic. He was so wonderful. He loved adulteresses, And I just gave it over to Rosa and said, now you go. She's open. Just go and share everything I taught you. Just go and tell her. So that's the power of stories.
So once we had these 66 stories ready, we were raring to go, and we'd made lots of friends by then, and so we started gathering groups together to tell them these Bible stories, to sort of start leading them on the way to getting to know Jesus. And we started off well. We got a number of groups, and but what happened is some of them, as we started telling the stories, they lost interest, and they had to go and catch fish and do this and do that and so forth. And other groups chased us away and said, we don't want this stuff here, we are Muslims, and And we actually managed to keep the peace. We said to them, the one guy especially was very angry at me. And I said to him, look, you're my friend, and I don't want to offend you, so can we stay friends? And we did. And many years later on, I stopped telling the stories to him and his family then, but many years later I did have the opportunity to share the gospel with him, and we had remained friends, which was a good thing. But I'd started with this group of men, and as I was telling it, they were whittling away, because it took months, because it was 66 stories, and we would go every weekday typically and tell the stories, the one story, and then let them think about it until the next day. And this group of mine just whittled down. Eventually it was one person, and I was leaving him a little printout. He could read actually, and he was one of the few. And I left him with this printout, and so he could go through it again, and because he really enjoyed it. But then eventually it was just him, and every day sitting there in the heat, and there's flies around you and mosquitoes. It's not very pleasant. And I was saying to the Lord, Lord, here I am, we've come all this way, given up our old lives, and here you have me sitting with one person. What am I doing? This is so ineffective, Isn't there a way to use my time more effectively? But I decided I will stick with it, and I will put everything into it, even if it's just this one person. And I remember one day I was sitting there with him at his little stall that he was selling stuff, and I was enthusiastically telling him the story. And suddenly when I just took a big breath to make my next point, and as I did this, I sucked in a fly. And that was like the end. I said, Lord, this is it. I can't go on like this anymore. But he came around as he always does, and I went back the next day. And 1 or 2 days later on, I was chatting to this guy, and outside of the story now, and he said to me, maybe just some background. He was well into his 20s, and in Mozambique, because of the war, many people didn't have opportunity to go to school. So they have these schools in the evenings where people can go to, and he was going to one of these schools to study. Anyway, so he said to me, the people at school are really enjoying these stories. And I'm like, what do you mean they're enjoying the story? He says, no, the printout you give me every day, I'm taking it to school, and I'm telling the story to the people. And I'm like, I went home and I said to her, but this guy's a Muslim, we can't use him as an evangelist, because he's actually evangelizing the people, because gradually we're building towards the gospel message. And so we decided, well, I can't stop him, can I, pretty much, so we just left it. And then a few days later, he said to me, the people are really enjoying it. There's Mwanis in the class, and there's Makuas, which is a neighboring tribe. And the Mwani guys have now started translating it into Makua, so the Makua guys can also understand. And I'm like, oh, okay, just like, this is getting out of hand. I don't quite know how to handle this. And but I just kept quiet and said, oh, that's good, not really knowing what to do. And then he said one day, the people are arguing about who gets to read the story first, and the teacher is even arguing. He wants to read it first. And there's big chaos in the class. And I said, how many people are there in your class? And he said, 66. And here I was sitting, sucking in flies, thinking I'm teaching one person, where actually he was going out as one of the locals, totally accepted, not a stranger, like I am, basically. And they were listening to the story coming from him. And it was so awesome that they were listening to this. And I said to him, but what school do you go to? And he said, the Islamic school up there. Eventually, because the people couldn't read, we'd recorded all the stories, we'd translated, and as we were recording it, we were putting it on small little MP3 players, and people were listening to them at home and in groups and so forth. But a lot of what they were listening to, we never heard about. But I remember sending a little cheap MP3 player to somebody. A friend of mine came and said his friend lives on a little island south of where we were living, and I'd never heard of this island before or since. And he said these people really, they've heard some of the stories, he'd visited them, and they really wanted more. So I thought, well, this is an opportunity. If people want to hear the gospel, here's the opportunity. And I said, but we hadn't finished the recordings yet at that point. So I said, at some point, they can just send the recorder back again so I can put some more on. So I gave it to him, and I sort of forgot about it. And sometime later, it came this little battered MP3 player, and I said, oh, the people are just loving it. And I said, where are they getting batteries? Because they have no power. And they said, oh, well, some of them come into town from time to time, and then they buy batteries. And I put all the latest recordings on there and sent it off again and forgot about it. Then quite some time, probably 2 years later, the same guy came to me and said, this friend of ours, they've been listening to those stories, and they believe everything. Now they had everything with the whole gospel and the whole works. And he said, but he's just asked me one thing. He said, he's listened to all these stories, and it's wonderful about what Jesus did for us and everything. But what he would just like to know is, what does a cross look like? And you know, I thought, wow, that's an assumption we'd made when we recorded. We never described what a cross looks like, because you would think everybody in the world knows what a cross looks like. And we actually hadn't described that in the stories, strangely enough. So I arranged with the guy. I said, okay, when your friend comes in again into town, arrange up front with me, and then I will show him a video about it, and he can see on the video. And so we did that. And one day at the door, here came this Muslim man with a long white cloak and with his prayer beads and his hat and everything. And I'm like, oh, hello. And he said, I'm here to see what a cross looks like. And there were two of them, and they came into the house, and I put it up on a laptop, and I showed them the movie. And this guy we had stories about Moses on video, so I wanted to give him an overview of the whole Bible. And so we had an 18-minute movie at that stage that had been translated and recorded and so forth into Kimwani. And this guy watched and said, oh yeah, there's Moses and Abraham, and we went through all the things. And it was just like when Jesus came onto the scene, this guy lit up. And he was like all attention, and he was into it, and every story he knew. He said, yes, I remember that, I remember that from what they'd been listening to the recordings. And then in that way, that guy saw what a cross looked like when he saw the video. And it was just awesome for him. And that was actually just before we'd left, and other people took over from us. And I don't know until today what became of that guy. But he said he had accepted what the gospel taught him, and our lessons on discipleship, he'd worked through them all, and so on. So sometimes we just hear these glimpses of what God is doing with what we've done, but we don't have the whole picture. But I'm sure one day when we get to heaven, we'll get some good surprises there, and maybe I'll meet him again there then.
Yeah. God provided for us in many ways over the years. But one that's really, for us up to now, we can't explain what happened, was we lived in this village, but then in town, in Pemba town, was a post office. And we had a post box there, and sometimes we would get letters or something. And there was, in a town south of us, like 6 hours drive from us, the Bible translators had a big base there, and they organized a conference open for everybody, and there was a well-known speaker that came, and we really wanted to go, but it was quite a lot of money. It's a lot of petrol, gas, and so we was thinking, can we go, should we go? We really don't have the money to spend on that. But we really thought that it would be good for us to just get out, just be with other people, and we prayed, said, God, if you want us to go, please provide the money. And then one day I went to the post office to just check if we had any mail, and the man working there gave me an envelope with no postage stamps on or anything, just our names written on it, and he said somebody gave it to him to put it in our post box, because there you go and you ask for your post and they give it to you. And so when we came home, I looked and there was $100 note in there. No note, not a letter written with it, nothing. We couldn't see whose handwriting it was or nothing. Up to today, we don't know where that money came from. Anyway, okay, this is great, then we can go to this conference. We did, with the kids were with us. We stayed there, and the end of the conference, we had to go pay the bill. It was for accommodation and the food and all these things, and the woman calculated and she said it comes to $100. So we literally gave her that note that was in the post box. So God provides, in wonderful, wonderful ways, and sometimes it's literally money that falls out of the sky and down in your post box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was so encouraging. Once I had malaria. That wasn't encouraging, but I was lying sort of passed out, and she was treating me and so on. And then all these brand new believers who had been Muslims 2-3 months before came to our house, and they came to pray for me. And it was a bunch of women. I think it was the women who came, about 3 or 4 of them. And a really simple prayer, they put their hands on me. And it was just like, bam, the fever was gone. I was still sick after that. It took me some time to recover, as you do with malaria. But the fever was gone, and it was instant, and it was so encouraging for us to see, what God has transferred into them, and also done for us through them. So that was really very nice. And it encouraged them as well.
It was very encouraging for them. They spoke about it for a long time, and we could have lots of talks about that, praying for people and
that God can use them as well.
Anybody, That's a good thing.
And another time I was a bit sick. I was feeling, I don't know, I can't remember if it was flu or just a cold or something, and I was walking home, and I walked right past the house of these friends of ours, and I knew in their culture, if I just walked past their house, I just wanted to get home and get into bed, but I knew if I walked past their house, they always knew everything that was going on in the community, and they would have known I walked past without greeting them. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just go in and say hi, and said, I'm not going to visit, I'm just going to go to bed. And as I walked in, they all used to always be in the backyard. They have like a area there between 3 houses that they built in, and then they stayed there. That's typically how they live. And in this courtyard, or whatever you want to call it, as I walked in, they were all just passed out on the floor. The one had malaria, and others had stomach problems, and I don't know what. Everybody was just, it was so pathetic, and I wasn't feeling well either. And when you get tired or sick or whatever, you lose your ability in the language that you've learned. So I just went up to them and said, look, I'm going to pray for you, but I'm not feeling well myself. So I'm just going to pray in my own language, in Afrikaans. But God understands all languages equally, so He'll understand my prayer, even if you don't understand my prayer. And they said, fine. And I prayed for them, and I sort of went home, got in bed and slept. The next morning, early, the sun had scarcely risen. There were a whole bunch of them at our door, and we said, what's going on? Why so early? And they said, we want to learn Afrikaans, because they'd all been healed, and they'd heard me doing the prayer in Afrikaans. And even though I'd explained to them, it's not the language that does anything, because they immediately assume it's something to do with the language, like it's some ritual or something. But then we had to explain to them again, it's not Afrikaans. God just understands all languages, and He answered my prayer to heal them.
My neighbor's name was Sifa, a typical Mwani woman, coming to the house all the time, asking for things. And to be quite honest, I really didn't like her. I was so embarrassed about it, but she was just a rude woman, and she was
difficult woman.
Unthankful, I thought, and she was just difficult. I would try to make friends with her and trying to be nice. I would go over one day. I remember I gave her a pumpkin, and she would just look at it and say, "What do you think what should I do with this? Where's the sugar and the oil?" She was so ungrateful, and she would just come to the house any time of day and just ordered me to take her to town or do this or what.
I remember well that when Sifa used to arrive there and I looked out the window and I saw her, I would say, "Bets, it's for you." I would just avoid this woman totally. She was not nice.
Yeah, but it was really starting to bother me because, we're there, we came all the way, coming here to bring the love of Jesus, and here she's my first one. When I walk out of the door, she's the first one, and I can't stand her, And I tried really to like her and do nice things and so on, but I started to pray about this. I said, "God, this is not right. This is really bothering me, but I can't do it out of myself. You will have to help me. You have to, please give me the love you have for it. Just give it to me, because there's no other way." And I don't know how long I've been praying that. And then one day Sifa came to the house again, and she came and we sat on the veranda talking. And as we were talking, I suddenly became deaf. I couldn't hear what she was saying. I could see her lips move, but I couldn't hear anything she was saying. And in this stillness, God just downloaded His love for me, for this woman. I just sat there and I realized I love her, but it was almost too much. It was just such a strong emotion. I've never felt that, and I just sat there and I was so emotional. I thought, don't ask me anything, I can't talk now. After a while my hearing came back and she was just talking on, and then she left, But then of course everything changed, because my attitude changed to it, because I just loved this woman. And I think because she felt my attitude has changed, she changed. And we became such good friends, and she became very polite. And she would come over and say, "Listen, I need to go to the bus stop tomorrow. Would you be able to take me to the bus stop tomorrow?" Things like that. She would thank me for stuff. She would just come over and just not come and complain or asking for things. She would just come over and she just wanted to be with me, and I with her. I remember one day I was, the police stopped me and they kept me next to the road for about an hour. They wanted bribe money, and by the end Hendrik came in the end, and it was just a terrible story, and I was very, very upset. I was very upset, and
it's very intimidating the way they do that.
And he said, "Oh, I can see you're not well now. Can I take you to the beach? You go and have a cold drink somewhere or do something?" And I said, "No, I'll just go to Sifa, And I just went to her and I just sat there with her, and after an hour I was fine. And that's what happened. God just gave me this love for this woman, and up to today, up to when we left, we were just such good friends, and in a way that we sort of counseled each other in a way, like just talking to one another. We just became good friends. I became really good friends with a lot of the Moani women, and I was really in with them. I had a Moani name. They invited me to lots of stuff that other outsiders would never have been invited to. I saw how they would prepare bodies for burial, which was a very close thing. They would even, I was in there as well. They just loved me. There was a big term of endearment, between us. And I went to their ceremonies at some of the other missionaries, the kind of ceremonies that they were never invited to. So I was very privileged in that, and I really felt I was a very good insider. And one day I was at a ceremony, an initiation ceremony for girls, and we did the fun stuff, dancing in the streets and eating and cooking since early in the morning, part of the whole thing. And then at one point, the one lady came to me and she said, "You must go home now, we're going to do ugly things, and I don't want you to see it." And I remember how my heart just fell into my stomach almost, like at that moment I realized that I will never be a Moani. it was a big realization for me, and I went through a thing of I felt like I failed in one way, and then on the other hand I felt like, well, I'm not better than them. Why do they separate me from what's going on? It was confusing as well. But in the end, I realized that it's actually a good thing. That, I mean, it was sweet of them to protect me. It was actually showing that they really respect me, you know. But just the thing of thinking that I'm a very good insider, and many missionaries think they should be a good insider, but you will never be. You should just be trying to be a good outsider.
Shetani akiniona iye atetema.
Anaisani Yesu wangu, shetani akiniona iye atetema.
Iye atetema, iye atetema. Shetani akiniona iye atetema.